Hey everyone, so as promised, we're going to be talking about origin traits and perks today. Now, I decided to merge both these tier lists into one video because I think I can fit everything, hopefully. And in the interest of time, obviously, we're going to GCX soon, and I do want to spend some time making damage rotations before I head out. So in order to do that, we got to compress a little bit. So let's talk about origin traits first. So some big jumps this season. Ambush, I think I severely underrated last season. And the reason for that is because origin traits, as a whole, compared to the best perks in the game, are generally pretty weak, right? And so Ambush actually gives you 10% damage for like 2 seconds for free, which is really good, right? If we ever get this on like a Cascade Point Heavy GL or on like a Rocket with Envious Assassin or something like that, would be really, really good for assisting in some burst damage. 10% is fairly large. Most origin traits that give you damage for free are fairly mediocre. For example, Crossing Over's damage boost is way, 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 way smaller. We're talking like low single digit numbers. So Ambush giving you 10% kind of unconditionally is really easy to proc, by the way, is really nice. It's really nice. I think it's deserving of the S tier. And when I was damage testing weapons with this Ambush origin trait, by accident I would proc it all the time, and it was kind of frustrating, honestly. So Ambush, I think, is a solid pick for S tier. Next up, we have Cursed Thrall. I think I underrated how good Cursed Thrall is. That explosion, that splash damage, is actually more potent than a lot of legendary splash perks that exist in this game. So I think Cursed Thrall is really good. The melee requirement is not that hard to meet given the current sandbox. Lots of melee abilities flying left, right, and center. So I think Cursed Thrall is really good. Crossing Over, I think I underrated it. Again, any free amount of damage is nice, although Crossing Over has a much lower amount of free damage than Ambush. It's not 10% by any stretch. It's like single digits, right? So Crossing Over, I think I underrated it. And plus, it gives you a little handling boost at the top of your mag as well, which is when handling tends to matter. So DDC is fine for me. Sundering, I think I also underrated as well. Anytime you're in any activity where you're maybe shooting turrets or shooting the Acolyte eyes or whatever, Sundering gives you a free big reload boost, which is particularly noticeable on some weapons without a good reload perk. So I think Sundering is not bad, right? And a lot of the origin traits that I originally had in C tier were just like handling boosts. So getting a reload boost, even if it's conditional, is not too bad. Definitely consistently proccable, I will say, in certain activities. So as long as you kind of, are participating in an activity where it makes sense to do Sundering, it's actually not a bad origin trait. Okay, so now a couple notes I wanted to make about the tiers this season. So originally last season, when I was explaining what each tier was supposed to represent, I said that some tiers are like, oh yeah, this tier, maybe, I don't know, like B tier or A tier, is supposed to be, oh, this is the equivalent of a legendary perk. And then maybe S tier was like, oh, this is better than legendary perk. But in my opinion, origin traits, but the way Bungie designs them, they're kind of different from legendary perks, I would say. They kind of set out to achieve different things. They're more like passive background effects. And so I'm not really going to judge them on the same merits necessarily. I will also say that F and E tier, I've shifted their definitions a little bit. F tier is a perk that does literally nothing good in PvE, right? So it's literally nothing good in PvE. Maybe like a range boost, for example, on weapons that don't need range, or it's like a very small range boost, or like Skulking Wolf is another example that basically does nothing in PvE. Whereas E tier, I did, stat boosts that are technically positive in PvE, but are basically unnoticeable. They're borderline unnoticeable, right? So that's going to be stuff like Disaster Plan, Gun and Run, Head Rush, Nadir Focus, Vanguard's Vindication. That's all going to go in the E tier. Nanotech Tracer Rockets is also a free damage boost, so shout out to Nanotech Tracer Rockets. When I did testing on Dimensional Hypotrichoid, this thing actually provided around a 6.5% damage boost across all reserves, which is really good for an origin trait, right? That's really, really nice. It scales with buffs, debuffs, perks, all that sort of thing. So Nanotech Tracer Rockets, pretty good. The only thing that we need to wait for is see how it scales onto something like a regular heavy GL, not a wave heavy GL, or a rocket, right? So a high damage heavy weapon archetype, because right now the only really relevant weapon it's on is on Dimensional. So yeah, I would say Nanotech Tracer Rockets, pretty good stuff. Pretty happy with that. Cast No Shadows is basically free Grave Robber, and out of all the legendary perks that you could have like stolen from, I suppose Cast No Shadows is, one of the better thieves, I suppose. Grave Robber is a pretty good perk to steal from, and I think it's really good on shotguns, and even some other weapons it would be pretty decent on as well. So, I think having it on shotguns is pretty great because you can free up the first perk column to do other stuff. So I think the S tier is pretty good for that based on its impact on certain weapons like Perfect Paradox. Advanced Reflexes and Hot Swap, these only really buff handling, and Advanced Reflexes especially only buffs handling conditionally. So I decided to put it in the D tier because handling, it's a nice stat, but you can definitely live without it. And there are certainly other origin traits that are in the C tier, in the B tier, that provide more useful benefits to uptime and quality of life that are probably more useful than these two. Dragon's Vengeance, I wrote in the notes here that it was hard to play around, but another thing is that I think I put it in the B tier in anticipation of maybe like a hotfix for the charge time buff, because it was so small, it was basically unnoticeable. That never came, and so Dragon's Vengeance, that charge time / draw time buff is really small, and so I've kind of decided to bump it down into the D tier. Also, its pulse monitor like effect is not very good, right? Pulse monitor, not to spoil anything, but it's not very high in the perk tier list either, and as a result, my opinion on Dragon's Vengeance will probably follow suit. One quiet moment is, you know, they reworked this origin trait to be a little bit better. However, it's really hard to trigger if you're playing normally. Basically, the way this origin trait works is that after you're out of combat for a couple seconds, if you choose to reload after that, you get a reload buff. And this reload timer, like that couple seconds that I mentioned, that threshold, is reduced to like 1.5 seconds after you get a kill. So this sounds okay in theory, but in practice, it's like after you're done killing an enemy, you tend to reload instantly. So it's like, would you rather reload instantly but have no reload buff, or would you rather wait to 1.5 seconds and then reload and then have a reload buff? It's like, doesn't really make any sense, because you're probably like sprinting away from the engagement at that point. So it really doesn't make sense. I think One Quiet Moment, kind of just a weird origin trait and very counterintuitive to play around. So Bray Inheritance was originally in the S tier. I sang this thing's praises when, you know, the DSC weapons first dropped with their new reprised versions. And unfortunately, you know, time has kind of passed, and I've realized that, number one, there are other origin traits that give you chunks of ability energy that are more consistent to proc, notably stuff like Indomitability. So that's number one. And number two, the actual chunks that you get from Bray Inheritance are really small. They're really small. And originally I thought like, well, I mean, they're on hit, right? So on weapons like Commemoration, you're going to shoot enemies a bunch, and you'll be able to proc it pretty consistently, but really in the end, the ability energy gains that you get from this thing, even if you're getting constant uptime, are really small. It's much less noticeable than I expected. Now, it is nice to get ability energy chunks to all 3 of your abilities. Most ability energy based origin traits and perks only give to 1 of your abilities, so it is kind of nice, and it is an on-hit effect, so I did put it in the B tier, but I think S was definitely a little too high for it if we actually think about the gameplay impact difference that this origin trait makes compared to something like an Ambush, or a Cursed Thrall, or a Cast No Shadows, or a Nanotech Tracer Rockets, right? It's definitely significantly worse than those origin traits. Next, we have Collective Purpose. It's a new origin trait from the Salvation's Edge raid weapons. This thing is just okay, right? It basically gives you a bunch of stat boosts that are related to uptime. For example, sword charge rate or bow draw time. Those are all boosted depending on the number of allies that are near you. Now, in my experience, the boosts are not insanely significant. You know, it's kind of just an uptime origin trait. It's all right. I'm not going to give it really any higher than D tier though, because I don't think it boosts any stats that are like super significant. Like when I was testing this origin trait on, for example, Summum Bonum against Riven, I got like 5 people to stand next to me on Riven to see if I could like max out the charge rate of the sword and hit like a really high speed combo, and it actually wasn't even enough for me to hit the max speed combo on Summum Bonum, so I was quite disappointed with this origin trait. I don't think anyone has really measured the exact amount of charge rate that this thing gives, for example, the swords, but at least in my experience, it's not insanely significant or anything like that. Restoration Ritual, I think I'm going to put it above the other B tier traits. If we go to the tier list eventually, once we're done with this, I think it is more noticeable than the other B tier traits. I think I underrated it a little bit because I was kind of complaining that in neutral content, you're probably not going to play around this and try to like get finishers and stuff, so you get the emergency reload. But, you know, compared to the other B tier traits, I think it is a little bit more useful. Rasputin's Arsenal, again, more useful than the other D tier traits. If we're looking at D tier traits, which are like handling boosts, for example, you know, a partial reload on shield break is certainly not bad on any sort of like anti-barrier primary, for example. So I would say that is an objectively pretty decent uptime perk, and so I decided to put it in the C tier. Radiolaria Transposer, again, just like Cursed Thrall, it is arguably less potent than Cursed Thrall because, you know, you need to get multiple kills to proc it. And I think the pools do significantly less damage than a Cursed Thrall explosion. However, it is more universal and you don't need to get a melee kill. And so it's really easy to use, and so I decided to put it in the S tier as well. Hakke Breach Armaments, I thought they were too niche to be in B tier. Harmonic Resonance, again, too niche to be in B tier, so I dropped them 1 tier. Dawning Surprise, I think the ability regen that you get from the little gift is relatively mediocre for the amount of payoff that you need to put into it. If we compare like number of kills versus ability energy that you get, and we compare this thing to something like Bray Inheritance or Indomitability, mathematically speaking, it ends up a lot worse, and you need to go pick up the gift, right? So it's not like you just get the gains immediately. So yeah, Dawning Surprise, not super great. Noble Deeds, I think Noble Deeds, again, same reason as Hakke. You have to be pretty specific about your playstyle, and you need to build into Noble Deeds to get rewards out of it. And the rewards that you do get out of it are just like, they're okay. They're fine. I wouldn't say that they're like worthy of being in the B tier though. Tex Balanced Stock, again, I probably put this in the C tier because I was citing Wilderflight and how useful it was on that. And then Wildstyle came out and I was like, yeah, I mean, this is kind of just, I don't know, it's a bit copium, I suppose. Tex Balanced Stock is extremely unlikely to proc in PvE. There are almost no weapons that you hip fire with regularly in PvE with. So yeah, pretty unlikely to trigger. I put it in the D tier. Unsated Hunger, also, you're very unlikely to have all 3 of your abilities completely depleted these days. So again, put it in the D tier. Explosive Pact, I thought the way that you proc this was like not too annoying, but it is a very weak effect for how much effort you need to do to fully stack it, right? So I'm sure if you've ever used Apex Predator before, you've probably seen the Explosive Pact stacks if you're like doing grenade damage or something like that, but the actual effect is like not really that useful. And yeah, the amount of effort you need to put in is like, yeah, it's not really worth using in my opinion. Alacrity, I was under the impression that this doesn't work solo. I think I was mixing it up with some perks, like regular perks, not origin traits. And so it does in fact work solo, which means that this is like, you know, a free big stat boost to some helpful stats in PvE. So it's only really held back by the fact that it only works solo. So I did put it in the C tier instead of in the F tier because I was under the impression that it just didn't work if you were solo. Finally, Dealer's Choice is a new origin trait. This thing works with a lot of currently decent meta weapons. For example, Still Hunt, The Call, Promemoria, all pretty good weapons. And if you are at ×2, right? So let's say you're running Still Hunt and The Call, and you get some kills with The Call, which is something a lot of people do pretty often, you will get basically an effect that's slightly better than Thresh, which is pretty nice, you know, decent amount of super energy. So Dealer's Choice, definitely pretty good, more noticeable than a lot of the origin traits in the B and C tiers. So let's go ahead and look at the origin trait tier list, and we'll briefly go over each tier, and then we'll move on to the perk tier list. So as you can see in the S tier, we have stuff like Soul Drinker, Radiolaria Transposer, Nano Munitions, which would be crazy if we ever got this on like a rocket or a heavy GL, but especially a rocket. Cursed Thralls, Cast No Shadows, you know, Nanotech Tracer Rockets, Land Tank for that free DR, and Ambush like we mentioned. In the A tier, we have like strong ability regen perks, or like good sustain perks, or like decent overflow perks, or free reload. You know, Dealer's Choice and Dominability, kind of same family. Bitter Spite, Run at the Over. We have Restoration Ritual and Extrovert. B tier, we have some neutral perks that are just like, they're decent, right? Field Tested takes a long time to stack up, but it gets a pretty good benefit out of it if you take that long to stack it up. Wildcard is like a worse version of these splash perks that are in like the S tier, so it's in the B tier. Stunning Recovery is decent for champ stun content, but it's kind of limited to that capacity. Psycho Hack, I think I underrated a little bit in the past, but yeah, it's pretty nice. You can get 10% damage reduction just for kind of like doing damage to a target, so you know, not that hard. Dream Work, I think, is a little bit more clunky than stuff like, you know, Runneth Over or Restoration Ritual or like Nano Munitions, for example. So yeah, I think that's why I put it in the B tier. Bray Inheritance, we talked about why we moved it down. And then down in these lower tiers, you have C tier, which is like maybe conditional, just mediocre effects kind of things. D tier, you have like stuff that's, you know, unlikely to proc, or the effect is really weak. E tier, you have like really weak effects that basically don't do anything in PvE, right, but are technically positive. And then you have F tier, which is like, these literally do not do anything in PvE that is useful or noticeable whatsoever. So that's it for origin traits, and next we're going to talk about perks. Alright, now on to perks. Now, some of you may have noticed there is a G tier and an H tier in the perk tier list now. And the reason for that is when I make these tier lists on stream, I usually rank every single option from rank 1 to rank 200 or whatever, and I go down the list, I look at the top cluster perks, I'm like, alright, that's the S tier. Maybe the difference between perk 6 and perk 7 is really big, and I'm like, okay, I want to make a distinction here. From here on out, this is A tier. And then I do that, and this time when I did it with perks, I got all the way down to F tier, and then I realized, well, there's clearly more groups to be had here. There's a distinction I need to make. And so that's why we have a G and an H tier now. So yeah, a little bit awkward and a lot of tiers for sure, but there are hundreds of perks in this game, so I hope that's a little bit understandable. So with that out of the way, that would explain basically all of these, right? All of these tiers extended things where I'm just like, yeah, these perks just need to be shifted down tiers because of, you know, we need to make room to fill in the bottom tiers. And so not any like particular reason, just kind of a natural extension. But let's talk about the more interesting stuff, which is stuff that didn't escape my wrath and was actually changed for a specific reason and not just because I was stretching out the tier list to fill out the other tiers. So number 1, Feeding Frenzy. Feeding Frenzy, most perks toward the bottom of the list got shifted down 2 tiers. Feeding Frenzy technically got like a I guess a buff in the tier list, and didn't shift down 2 tiers, only shifted down 1, and that's because I think I underrated the fact that it's 2 kills to basically max any normal weapons reload, and so getting 2 kills is not that hard in endgame content with a primary these days, with all the crazy primaries that we have. However, is it as good as something like an Enlightened Action or an air trigger or like a rapid hit? Certainly not, because those, you don't really need to get any kills. You could just be shooting a champ and you can trigger those pretty easily. So Feeding Frenzy is still in the E tier, but not in the F tier like it would have been normally had I just shifted it down like the rest of the perks. Air Trigger. Now, Air Trigger is a new perk. It does 2 things. It basically maxes your reload if you're in the air, so you can jump to proc it, unlike Field Prep, which is crouching, which might be a little bit more awkward. And then it also boosts your ammo reserves by the same amount as Field Prep. Now, the only problem I have with Air Trigger is that unlike Field Prep, when you enhance Field Prep, you get increased ammo reserves, and you get bonus ammo reserves on top of what Field Prep already gives you. Enhanced Air Trigger does not do that. Enhanced Air Trigger is, I believe, a stat buff, and so it's a little bit worse than Field Prep in that regard. Now, I will say jumping is maybe a little bit less awkward than crouching, but I will say still that I think the jumping aspect of Air Trigger is a little bit overrated compared to perks like Enlightened Action, for example, that don't require you to change your playstyle at all, or like think about, jumping while reloading in any way. However, I will say Air Trigger is, yeah, certainly a little bit more higher quality of life than Field Prep, but the lack of the additional ammo on Enhanced Air Trigger is a bit of a shame, a missed opportunity in my opinion. Okay, Deconstruct got shifted down from B to F tier, and the reason for that is because the ammo refund is now patched. The ammo refund's patched, so the only reason you would ever use this thing is to do damage to like a vehicle or like a construct-based boss, which are relatively, uncommon in this game. So yeah, outside of that niche use, Deconstruct, pretty bad. Counterattack, I moved down like 3 tiers, and that's because it is awful. It is awful to proc consistently. I've tried using this thing because I was like, okay, maybe this thing might be decent if a boss is doing constant damage to you, and maybe you're gonna block and then go back for another swing. And it's in the first column too, so you can run double damage perks. You can run like Counterattack and Surrounded or Counterattack and Whirlwind Blade. And lo and behold, it sucks. It is horrible to proc consistently, number 1. Really, really annoying. And even if I calculated the math, even if mathematically you were able to proc this consistently every single time, you would block, go in for a swing, do some attacks, and then block on the next attack immediately, this thing is mathematically still not worth it because of how long the blocking and recovery animation takes when you take damage. So Counterattack in the G tier. Now, quick note about tiers this season. The G and the H tier. H tier is basically PvP only perks that only affect PvP stats for the most part, and then G tier is going to be stuff that's like is practically useless, but still, technically a positive benefit in PvE, even if it's a really poor one or a minimal one or a very rare one, let's say. Chaos Reshaped, on the complete other end of the spectrum, is a top of S tier perk, right? It's really, really good. Best in slot sustained damage, 35% damage boost, doesn't even require you to swap weapons like pre-nerf bait and switch, also gives you 35 HP every 7 seconds if you're at tier 2 of the perk's activation requirements, which is really, really awesome. People use this in low mans and solos for extra sustain, and of course, it's an excellent damage perk as well, so shout out to Chaos Reshaped. Headseeker, technically this would have been in the H tier because F tier was the former bottom like PvP only tier, but technically speaking, like Headseeker, if you do shoot enemies in the body, like you can crit them, crit other enemies maybe later on for more damage, so technically it's positive, better than PvP perks like Moving Target, for example. So yeah, I did put in the G tier instead of the H tier. Not like I don't think anyone cares about the G and H tier, but that is where I put it. Heal Clip, when I last made this tier list, I believe Heal Clip was at like 50 HP or tier 1 cure. Now it's at tier 2 cure. It also is on much better weapons. I think I mentioned last time that Heal Clip's usability scales with the type of weapons that we have it on, and on the current weapon field we have it on a wave frame, we have it on a rocket sidearm, which are absolutely excellent to have Heal Clip on, and they really showcase its full potential, which is why I think it's deserving of an S tier placement. High Ground and Precision Instrument are kind of similar in the reasons why I chose to buff them up 2 tiers, and that's because both of them were buffed so that their actual damage perk number is quite a bit higher, a little bit of an increase. And then High Ground was also buffed so that it lingers and also stacks to 3, kind of like an Adrenaline Junkie stacks to 5, but immediately gets all of its stacks if you meet its special requirement. High Ground is kind of the same. And Precision Instrument, I also didn't know at the time that Precision Instrument has more lenient thresholds between crits if you have like a draw time or a charge time based weapon. So that kind of improved my opinion of Precision Instrument a little bit, and so as a result, both of these perks are going to be in the C tier. Obviously not as good as some consistent damage perks like Frenzy, Chaos Reshaped, but High Ground, Precision Instrument, definitely more interesting and worth taking a look at in some cases. Strategist is basically the class ability version of Demo and Pugilist. Unfortunately, class abilities are kind of like the worst abilities in the game right now, just generally speaking. Most builds don't even need or benefit from class ability regen, like Prismatic Hunter and Titan. You don't really need your dodge back. If you're on combination blow, you get it back naturally. On Titan, you don't really need your thruster because it doesn't really do anything besides maybe proc Hoil more often. But Strategist is basically just a waste of a perk slot. There are plenty of perks in the first column that are plenty solid that you would rather have over Strategist, and also it doesn't like reload your weapon the way Demo does. So Strategist, yeah, really not great, and we're gonna leave it in the F tier. Next up, we have Adrenaline Junkie. Now, Adrenaline Junkie, I think, is comparatively better than the other 5-stack roam perks. And so, you know, just throwing a grenade, getting a single kill with it is pretty easy to get that 5-stack perk on something like a machine gun with like Demo AJ. So I think I didn't move it down 2 tiers. I only moved it down 1, which is why it's now in the D tier. Killing Tally is a kind of a casualty of better perks being released that have eclipsed it. Now, obviously, Killing Tally was an excellent perk on stuff like machine guns back in its heyday, but now Desperate Measures exists, and Desperate Measures gives a similar total damage bonus at its maximum tier, except Desperate Measures can activate while your weapon is stowed. It doesn't go away when you stow your weapon, and it can get additional stacks off of ability kills. So Desperate Measures tends to be the better perk than Killing Tally. I think most people have agreed on that in the community when it comes to like machine gun perks and stuff like that. So I think Desperate Measures being stiff competition has kind of moved Killing Tally down 1 tier. Tilting and Windmills does basically nothing. Like, I don't know why I put it in the A tier. It should have been in the F tier back when F was the lowest. Now H is the lowest, so I put it in the does basically nothing tier because Glaive, you know, blocking movement speed is kind of just a joke, right? It's kind of a joke perk. Okay, Reverberation is up next. Reverberation sounds okay in theory. In practice, it does nothing on loss signal, so it does nothing on area denial GLs. I don't think it's particularly useful on rocket sidearms. There are much better perks there. And on rockets, you know, rockets are already pretty high blast radius. You have stuff like Wolfpack rounds as well. And it's in the same column as Bipod. So you would basically never take this thing. Now that being said, you know, maybe H tier is a little harsh. I mean, technically it is a positive benefit in PvE, but it does pretty much effectively nothing on all weapon types. So I decided to put it in the H tier. Maybe it's more deserving of G tier, but we'll leave it here for now. Mega Neura, people asked me to add Sunset like exclusive pinnacle perks to this tier list, and so Mega Neura is a massive boost to Dragonfly damage, but I suppose you also have to use Dragonfly for it to be worth it, so you're kind of giving up like neutral reload perks, you're giving up other perks that are possibly better than Dragonfly. Now, the damage boost is quite substantial, but I have not really seen this thing in action on anything where it would be particularly useful, like maybe a machine gun or something like that, so if it ever returns on like a machine gun, we'll talk about it then, but for now, I'm just going to put it in the G tier, especially because you have to run kind of 2 perks for it to be worth it. So yeah, I'm just going to leave it in the G tier. Next up, we have Trench Barrel. I think I underrated Trench Barrel last season. Trench Barrel is really good. It's a 50% damage boost, which is insanely high. That's like Golden Tricorn tier 2. And except the only difference is you only need to melee. And the thing about aggressive shotguns, which Trench Barrel is best on, is that not only do they get a crazy total damage boost out of Trench Barrel, but this thing activates on ranged melee damage now, which is really nice. On top of that, Trench Barrel isn't DPS loss, right? Most damage perks where they're this high, there's some sort of activation requirement that lowers your DPS. With Trench Barrel, you just need a melee, and meleeing between aggressive shotgun shots actually doesn't slow down your fire rate, which is really excellent on Trench Barrel. So shout out to Trench Barrel. We love Trench Barrel. And we're going to move on to autoloading holster and demo. Now, autoloading holster has fallen out of the meta a little bit because of, you know, perks like Envious, Reconstruction, Rewind Rounds. It's just a little bit worse than those perks, and Bungie is giving out Reconstruction to weapons like Candy now. So, you know, as a result, kind of similar to Killing Tally, just going to move it a tier lower because there's just better competition these days than autoloading holster. Next, we have Demolitionist. Demolitionist, same thing, really. I think it's kind of falling out of the meta a little bit. Now, don't get me wrong, demo rotations, grenade rotations, they're cool. They definitely scratch that itch for some people. But I think grenade regen as maybe at like an all-time low in terms of relevancy in the current sandbox. And, you know, grenade rotations in general are kind of just worse off right now than they are compared to other more traditional damage rotations. So demo, I think, you know, in concept, it is a really good perk, and I love seeing it on stuff like machine guns. But if we actually look at the S tier, which we'll look at the tier list after we're done talking about the changelog here, but I think you'll agree with me that demo really doesn't hold a candle to all the other perks that are in the S tier, and so it kind of makes sense more as an A tier perk when you look at the other great perks that we have in this game in the top tier. Okay, Destabilizing Rounds had its internal cooldown reduced to 3 seconds, which is a nice little kind of stealth buff for it. However, you know, Volatile is not one of the greatest subclass debuffs that you can apply to enemies, and it does have that proc, you know, time requirement now that it, you know, got because I assume because of retrofit. So it's a bit unfortunate what happened to Volatile. That being said, I'm excited to see how this perk plays out. It's obviously not A tier like Incandescent is, but I'm excited to see how this perk plays out. And when I get my hands on like a Chronophage, I'll let you guys know what my thoughts are on this. If I think it's a little bit worse, I'll probably move it down. It's unlikely to move up though. Archer's Tempo. So I made the promise last time I made a perk tier list to individually evaluate all perks on their own merits while ignoring the weapons that they roll on. And I think I kind of broke that promise with Archer's Tempo. Archer's Tempo is a fundamentally very important perk to have on most bow rolls, and so I think it is deserving of the B tier. If we compare the other perks that are in the B tier to Archer's Tempo, I think it does kind of hang with the gang. And you know, if we're comparing it to like essential reload perks, for example, like Enlightened Action or Rapid Hit, I think it deserves to be in that territory for bows, and so that's why I've decided to put it in the B tier. Relentless Strikes and Whirlwind Blade are two kind of very similar perks in terms of why I moved them up. They both interact with Pack Hunter now, and so they both have become very strong perks because Whirlwind Blade's previous issue was that it had scaling problems, and Relentless Strikes, it was kind of just like the default go-to pick on swords, but it wasn't anything crazy. With Pack Hunter triggering Relentless Strikes, the total damage bonus that you get is insane. So that's why I decided to put Relentless Strikes in the S tier over the B tier where it used to be. Unrelenting is up next. Now, as the note says, it's largely overshadowed by Heal Clip, but the way I like to think about Unrelenting is this. On paper, Unrelenting doesn't sound so bad, especially after the buff it received, like I think about a year or two ago. It's actually not that bad of a perk. However, Unrelenting tends to be in columns where you want to compare it to other perks, and when you ask the question, would I rather have Unrelenting or X decent perk in this column, the answer is always, I want the other perk, right? And so it's a bit awkward because on paper, Unrelenting is not that bad, but in practice, you know, you never really take it over other, you know, perks, and that's why I think it's deserving of being dropped all the way to the F tier, on top of Heal Clip being introduced as some really rough competition for Unrelenting. Next up, we have Triple Tap. Triple Tap is just a 1-tier drop, kind of similar to stuff like Demo. It's just kind of moving out of the current meta. When you have a perk that is just objectively worse than another perk in every single way, that being 4 times, it's kind of hard to justify its existence in one of the top tiers, so I decided to drop it down 1 tier to the C tier. Field Prep and Overflow are kind of similar. They're both less relevant in the current meta. Field Prep is really only taken for increased reserves and not so much for its reload benefit, so you're never really going to see it on primaries or special weapons, to be honest with you. On something like a heavy weapon though, yeah, Field Prep could see some use, right? Maybe on something like a machine gun, but machine guns tend to like reload perks, like simulated reload perks in their first column. You know, rockets, they don't really need reload perks as much if you're not using them for damage rotation, so I could see Field Prep being used on like a bipod rocket. Enhanced Field Prep is pretty nice on those, but again, that's a pretty small niche, and so I'm not willing to really put it in the A tier. We're going to put it in the B tier with Air Trigger, where I think it belongs. Overflow is the same thing, right? I mean, you have Reconstruction on so many weapons right now, which is effectively Overflow. I know Enhanced Overflow can overflow slightly past, you know, twice your mag size, so on rockets it can bring you to 3 if it's enhanced, but still, you know, we have yet to see that on a rocket yet. And Envious Assassin kind of does the same thing without requiring you to walk over an ammo brick. So yeah, I mean, I could see this maybe being useful on like a rocket in the future, and you know, maybe people are going to make like a bunch of special finishers in a row or something and do like a special rotation with it. But for now, that's pretty niche, right? So I probably put in the C tier. It's just less relevant in the current meta compared to where it used to be, and I certainly wouldn't take it on like specials or primaries generally speaking these days, outside of a few niche cases. Archer's Gambit. So Archer's Gambit is a really nice perk. You just need to hit a hipfire precision shot, which is not that hard, to get a massive draw time reduction. Like compared to Archer's Tempo, this thing's draw time reduction is much more noticeable. However, it is only rolling in the 4th column right now, and as a result, you kind of have to run like Archer's Tempo, Archer's Gambit, which I think is what Bungie's intended role is for you to try out. And while that is, you know, it sounds really cool, it's kind of like Cascade Point for bows, it like self procs. The only problem with this is that you kind of lose out on splash perks and utility perks, which I think bows, you know, something like Volt Shot, for example, Archer's Gambit Volt Shot, that'd be a pretty cool roll. But unfortunately, you don't really have access to that. And so for now, I think Archer's Gambit is kind of restricted by being in the 4th column. Once it's in the 3rd column, I think maybe we'll see more interesting interactions with it. But for now, I think C tier is fine for it, lower than Archer's Tempo, which I think is a more fundamentally important perk for bows. Pugilist is up next. Now, same reason as Strategist, right? This thing is obviously a better perk than Strategist, so it's higher up in the F tier. But in my opinion, I was looking at the perks in like the E tier and like the D tier, and I was just kind of saying like, is Pugilist really more useful than these? And the answer was kind of just no, because Pugilist, you know, think about it. It's On most weapons that you're using this with, you're getting a 10% melee refund back for getting 1 kill. And generally speaking, there are more resource efficient ways to be spending your time to try and get melee regen. And on the classes where melee is kind of relevant and melee regen is relevant, so I'm looking at basically Prismatic Titan here, running a Pugilist weapon is not really the most resource efficient way of getting your melee back. So yeah, that's why I decided to put Pugilist in the F tier. Also, like, using your melee obviously doesn't refill your weapon the way Demo does, so you lose out on a bit of utility in that regard as well. Next up, we have Cascade Point. Now, Cascade Point, I think, is more relevant now than the last time I made this tier list. We have more weapons with Cascade Point now. It's more relevant for burst damage, and I'm excited to see if Bungie will introduce it to maybe some other weapons that it might be more interesting on. But yeah, Cascade Point, good perk. It's like a 60-something% increase to DPS, despite not increasing your total damage, which is absolutely insane. There's no damage perk in the game that really goes that high. So yeah, Cascade Point, pretty strong stuff. So yeah, a little bit more specialized for sure, but I think it is a pretty strong perk when it comes to damage rotations. Next up, we have Physic. Now, Physic got nerfed recently. It originally gave Restoration ×2 to you and your teammates whenever you triggered that healing effect using the support auto rifle, no hesitation. However, now it's just Restoration ×1. So that brought it from, I don't know, maybe like an A tier perk down to a C tier perk, because Restoration ×1 is pretty weak in the current sandbox. You can get that pretty easily by just picking up an orb on Facet of Purpose and a Solar Super on Prismatic. But that being said, you know, it's still a decent perk. It's still probably the pick if you want to run a support-oriented support auto rifle role. So yeah, Physic is still pretty decent, but it's not as strong as it used to be. There's a couple perks here that I just overrated last patch. I think Lasting Impressions downsides, I kind of ignored them too much last patch, so I put it in the G tier. There's almost no reason why you would ever use this perk in the current field of rocket damage perks. Subsistence, I think I overrated last patch as well. It's good on stuff like Commemoration, obviously, but there are other perks that are essentially just free firing for a long time, which, you know, don't really require you to be shredding red bars constantly. We have Sword Logic. I think Sword Logic I heavily overrated last patch. Looking at this thing now, in order to get a substantial damage bonus in the way that like Killing Tally or Desperate Measures have, you need to kill a tier 3 combatant, which is pretty uncommon with most of the weapons that Sword Logic rolls on. So yeah, I'm not a huge fan of Sword Logic. Obviously, keeping it at that max tier and that max duration, it's a desirable goal to have while you're using this weapon, but the amount of times that you're killing a boss with a weapon to get this thing up to tier 4 is like almost like never. So I think Sword Logic is, you know, in theory, you know, it sounds like a pretty cool perk, but in practice, you're generally not getting this thing past like tier 1 or tier 2. And at that point, you may as well just use a better perk that just scales off of tier 1 kills regardless. Wellspring, I think I overrated it last patch as well. This thing is basically just a worse version of like Demo or like Pugilist. Because you generally care about one of your abilities at a time. Wellspring just distributes your ability energy gains at a less efficient rate than something like Demo or Pugilist, while also not really targeting the abilities that you want. So it's kind of just doesn't really make sense. I think Wellspring should get buffed a little bit so that the total ability energy gained is more than something like Demo, to account for the fact that it's distributing to all 3 of your abilities, especially given that usually you don't really care about 1 or 2 of your abilities at a time. So next up, we have Threat Detector. Last patch, I really highly overrated, I think, shotgun swapping in the endgame DPS meta. This season, you saw me knock down a lot of shotguns that were specifically for swapping down to lower tiers, and Threat Detector as a result will also be knocked down to lower tiers. Threat Detector, there's a lot of pretty neutral reload perks these days and handling perks that don't really require you to be near 2 enemies to get like a strong benefit out of it. So yeah, Threat Detector, I'm not really the biggest fan, and yeah, that's why I've decided to put Threat Detector in the F tier. Next up, we have Bipod. Bipod, I think A to S tier is totally reasonable, especially given that we now have Crux Bipod swapping. The fact that you can essentially increase your reserves by like 50% and then swap back to another perk so that you have full rocket damage is pretty crazy. On top of that, Bipod is just a pretty strong perk in stuff like GMs and Day 1s for burst / ad clear and traversal encounters where you're moving in like a big group. Compulsive Reloader and Collective Action. Now, Compulsive Reloader, I think I underrated this perk a little bit. A flat 50 reload that doesn't even scale with your mag size until you hit under 50% is pretty nice. So if you're like an ADHD reloader like some people are, Compulsive Reloader is probably not an awful perk. Collective Action, I haven't dropped to 2 tiers like most of the tier extended perks here, and that's because Prismatic has really increased the rate at which subclass pickups are generated. Everyone's making like fire sprites and tangles and ionic traces left, right, and center, and so Collective Action probably does have higher uptime this patch than last patch. That being said, I still don't think it's like a super relevant perk given its relatively mediocre damage increase for the cost that it incurs. So yeah, I'm going to leave it in the E tier, and we're going to move on to Eddy Current. Now, Eddy Current, I also didn't drop it 2 tiers like the other tier extended perks. F tier might be a little low for this thing. If you're amplified, it basically maxes your reload all the time, which is definitely doable on Prismatic if you're running like an arc weapon, but it is fairly situational. And if you're not amplified, I think the sprinting effect is relatively weak. It's kind of like one quiet moment where, like, if you're in combat, you're probably going to run out of the duration of the perk by the time you actually want to use it and reload. So it's a bit awkward in that way. But if you're amplified, this thing is great. So it kind of really just depends. If you're using this thing on, like, you know, an arc weapon that you're going to be using a lot on Prismatic or arc, and you're going to be amplified all the time, then it definitely makes sense to run Eddy Current. But, you know, on most subclasses, this perk is just not that great neutrally, in my opinion. Next, we have Explosive Light. I think Explosive Light, I really saw this as like a rocket and heavy GL damage perk. I didn't really account for the roam potential of heavy GLs and rockets using Explosive Light to max blast radius and increase total damage. So for those of you who are not aware, heavy GLs basically get like a 45 to 50% increase per shot with Explosive Light, which is a crazy total damage increase for like a legendary weapon to have. And so if you're in something like a GM and you want to use like a heavy GL to kill champs, as long as you're making orbs all the time, this is a really great way of increasing your ammo efficiency or shots to kill on majors, mini bosses, or even just straight bosses in stuff like GMs. Incandescent, I really didn't think was deserving of being a C tier perk. You know, it triggers Singeing, Scorching does kind of stagger adds a little bit, and you have the potential for an ignition, although I think most weapons you don't really play for that, given how many kills you need to get an ignition these days with Incandescent. But yeah, I think I underrated it a lot. I don't know about A tier. I might float it down to a lower tier in the next upcoming patch. However, I think A tier is a fine place to put it for now. I did reevaluate it, and I think it's definitely better than C tier at least. Desperate Measures, we talked about this already, but this is basically the Killing Tally stand-in. I think it is the best roam damage perk in the game for like general neutral gameplay, whether we're talking machine guns, rockets, items, whatever it is. This thing is really easy to stack up while it's in the pocket, and yeah, just a big fan of this thing, so we're going to put it in the A tier. Dragonfly, I think I slightly underrated it last patch. I think E tier is a little rough for it. It does do a decent amount of splash damage compared to something like Firefly, and you know, it's not really... It doesn't really roll on most weapons these days, so I feel like it's been kind of out of the spotlight for a while, but the actual effect of the perk is like not horrible, and I put a lot of splash perks in kind of high tiers this season, so I think D tier is fair for it. I don't think it deserves to be in like the E tier. Firing Line, I think, is reduced in relevance thanks to perks like High Ground and Precision Instrument. Yeah, it's not horrible, but it's certainly not great either. I think C tier is fine for it given the other perks that we're going to see in the B and A tier, so yeah, that's why I decided to put Firing Line where it is. Next, Cluster Bomb. I think I slightly underrated Cluster Bomb initially. Cluster Bomb's damage increase is actually not insignificant if you guys go ahead and look at the Wolfpack tab in my DPS spreadsheet. And so I decided to put it in the E tier. Obviously, you're not going to take this thing over like a standard, you know, traditional damage perk in the 4th column. But if this thing is in the 3rd column, for example, like on Bray Tech, it is potentially useful. Obviously, clusters, they spread very, very far. So unless you have a boss that's like really, really large in model size, Cluster Bomb's not very good. But I think I did underrate it a little bit and definitely does not deserve to be like in the F tier. Okay, To the Pain is a new perk. You basically get a little bit of handling if you take damage while you're doing damage. This is generally not very useful in, you know, just anything, because just a handling boost is, you know, there's plenty of perks that give handling boosts that don't require you to take damage. And on top of that, if you get like no reload out of this, for example, I feel like if like Enlighten Action is like doing damage gives you reload and handling, I feel like To the Pain should be like taking damage gives you reload and handling, except To the Pain doesn't give you reload. So it's kind of just, I don't know. The payoff for this perk is, it's pretty easy to activate, but the payoff for this perk is not great. Tap the Trigger, I moved it above H tier because I kind of did like using Shoot to Loot and Tap the Trigger on my Path of Least Resistance when I initially first crafted it with that role. So I think Tap the Trigger, you know, if you want to use it on like a Shoot to Loot weapon that doesn't have access to explosive payload, for example, maybe it has some utility. You know, maybe it's a little bit better than just like a PvP strictly only perk. So yeah, that's why I put it in the G tier instead of like in the H tier. That's debatable, but you know, that's just kind of my thoughts given my personal experience with like Path of Least Resistance. Okay, and finally wrapping things up under our tier extended perks, we have a couple down here. Circle of Life, I think it has tough competition in slot. Obviously, if you're on a support frame auto rifle, this is really easy to proc, and it's designed for a support frame auto rifle. However, there are other perks that boost your damage or provide more utility in this slot, like for example, Incandescent I think is more useful. So yeah, tough competition in slot. There are similar damage perks out there that, you know, don't require you to heal or anything like that. So if we're just measuring the perk on its own merits, yeah, I think D tier is a fair place for it. Perks like Keep Away, Slice, Stats for All, Swashbuckler, and Volt Shot, I just underrated them last patch, I think. Stats for all, for example, I think it's actually not horrible on some weapons that, you know, it's pretty easy to proc on. You know, there's a lot of weapons where you'll shoot 3 enemies naturally without reloading. Even if you're not like intentionally playing around it. Like my big problem with the for all perks was that a lot of people were telling me that they were like intentionally shooting 3 enemies separately to trigger it. And while modifying your playstyle for one for all is like a bit awkward so that you can get your damage bonus on the first enemy and then also the subsequent enemies that follow, I think stats for all it's less awkward because you don't really need reload until you're done shooting all of your enemies. So you can actually just go ahead and like mow through your first, second, and third enemy and then reload, and then you'll have the buff after that. I think Slice, I think I underrated it last patch. It's a good way of applying Sever. Now, is it like so excellent that it's going to be better than other first column perks in the majority of cases? No, but I think I did underrate it last season. Swashbuckler, same reason as Adrenaline Junkie, like we talked about. I think it's not bad, and melee builds are kind of like all the rage right now, so Swashbuckler is pretty easy to activate. That being said, is it better than perks like, you know, Desperate Measures and stuff like that? I don't think so, but it's not bad. Volt Shot, I think I also underrated last patch, so I boosted it into the same tier as Incandescent. Firefly, I also underrated last patch, I believe. It has a reload and a splash perk combined, so on weapons like Nullify, for example, Firefly Incandescent goes really hard. Full auto trigger system, I don't think this deserves to be like at the bottom of the list. It does increase your rate of fire on shotguns. On some shotguns, for example, like if they got like full auto cascade on a rapid, that could be potentially useful for some sort of insane burst where you have 2 fire rate increases. So yeah, full auto trigger system, obviously very useless on most weapons, but on shotguns, because of that rate of fire increase, I don't think it deserves to be in like the G or the H tier. Finally, we have Threat Remover and Kinetic Tremors. Threat Remover is essentially useless in my opinion, because on the shotguns that it rolls on in PvE, you want handling for when you pull the weapon out. And because Threat Remover is dependent on you hitting pellets, you can't get that handling until you actually have the weapon out and are already shooting it. So Threat Remover kind of removes half of the equation when it comes to handling being good. It's only going to really increase your handling and give you those benefits once you are like stowing the weapon, which is like, you know, not that useful. Finally, we have Kinetic Tremors. I put it in the same tier as Volt Shot, Firefly, and Incandescent, and yeah, it's just strictly for that reason. I think it's worthy of being next to those other A tier splash perks. So let's go ahead and look at our perk tier list now and scroll all the way to the top. As you can see, S tier is going to be like gameplay defining perks. These perks change how you use weapons and change how you play. Chaos Reshaped, you know, it's an excellent damage perk, best in class, plus it gives you that healing sustain. 1-2 Punch enables half the melee builds in the game right now. Frenzy is just an excellent overall uptime perk. Reconstruction and Envious allow for new damage rotations and allow for better uptime. A tier is going to be perks that are just like pretty solid neutral gameplay, so Demo, Recom, Kinetic, Incandescent, Desperate Measures, perks like that. And as for B tier and the tiers that follow, I believe they're fairly straightforward. These are just clusters of perks where I looked at the top perk and the bottom perk in every single tier, and I was like, yeah, do these deserve to be in the same tier together? Yes. And then I looked at the bottom of the B tier, for example, and the top of the C tier, and I'm like, is there a distinction between these two perks? And I would say yes, for example. So yeah, that's kind of what I did for all of the rest of the tiers. Quite difficult to explain like the general feel of every tier past B tier because there's just so many tiers and so many perks that are so different. But I hope that kind of makes sense. This tier list is obviously one of the most, you know, difficult to kind of parse because there's just so many perks in this game. There's 184 perks. And so that's why, you know, I had a real, you know, it's a real struggle to tier list perks, but that's kind of my thoughts on all the different perks. And yeah, a little bit rushed, but this tier list is not as refined as like the exotic weapon tier list or the other ones, but over time we'll gradually get it to where it needs to be. If you have any feedback on this tier list, feel free to leave it in the comments, and tomorrow we'll have the subclass tier list out, which I'm a lot more happy with than the last one that we made. So yeah, I hope you guys enjoy that one, and I'll see you later.